The quantum displays flickered red across every major trading floor in the galaxy, as Marcus Chen watched the financial universe collapse in real time. Standing in the observation deck of the Central Galactic Banking Authority headquarters on Nexus Prime, he could see the panic spreading through the crystalline towers that housed the most powerful financial institutions in known space. Numbers that had taken millennia to accumulate were vanishing in microseconds, and the algorithms that had governed interstellar commerce for thousands of years were failing one by one. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Zeridian exchange had just lost 47% of its value in the past hour. The Altarian credit union was hemorrhaging deposits so fast that their quantum processors couldn't keep up with the withdrawal requests. 3 of the galaxy's oldest banking houses had already declared emergency suspensions, and the ripple effects were spreading to every inhabited system faster than light-speed communications could carry warnings. Marcus pressed his palm against the cool transparisteel window and watched as emergency shuttles evacuated non-essential personnel from the banking district below. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, a simple human accountant from a backwater planet, was witnessing the end of the most sophisticated financial system the galaxy had ever known. The crisis had been building for months, though the galaxy's financial elite had dismissed every warning sign with the arrogance that came from 10,000 years of unbroken prosperity. The Galactic Banking Consortium, led by the ancient and supposedly infallible Zerion dynasty, had built their empire on mathematical certainties and algorithmic predictions that had never failed them before. Their quantum processing systems could calculate risk factors across billions of variables, predict market fluctuations with 99.7% accuracy, and manage the financial flows of entire star systems with automated precision. Marcus had seen the first cracks in the foundation 6 months earlier while auditing the books for the human colony of New Geneva. The settlement was barely a footnote in galactic economics, a farming world that exported grain and imported manufactured goods through a dozen intermediary banks and trading houses. But when Marcus traced the financial pathways that connected New Geneva to the broader galactic economy, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. The entire system was built on recursive debt loops that fed back into themselves in increasingly complex patterns. Every transaction generated microfees that were reinvested in derivative instruments that created more transactions that generated more fees in an endless cycle. The beauty of it was that as long as the galaxy kept expanding and new worlds kept joining the system, the exponential growth could continue indefinitely. But Marcus had run the numbers, and he knew that exponential growth in a finite system always led to collapse. He had tried to raise his concerns through proper channels, submitting detailed reports to the Colonial Banking Authority, which forwarded them to the Regional Financial Oversight Board, which passed them along to the Galactic Banking Consortium's Risk Assessment Division. Each level of bureaucracy had reviewed his findings and dismissed them with the same polite condescension that humans had grown accustomed to receiving from the galaxy's older and supposedly wiser species. The Zerion dynasty, whose crystalline forms had evolved mathematical processing capabilities far beyond human comprehension, had been particularly dismissive. Their response to Marcus's report had been a form letter explaining that human intuition, while occasionally useful for primitive economic systems, was insufficient for understanding the sophisticated models that governed galactic finance. They had thanked him for his concern and suggested that he focus on the simpler accounting tasks that were more appropriate to his species' limitations. The Zephyrian Banking Guild, whose members existed as pure energy patterns that could process financial data at the speed of thought, had been even more direct in their rejection. Their spokesperson, a being called Flex79, had informed Marcus that his calculations were based on outdated economic theories that had been obsolete for centuries. The new quantum financial models, they explained, had evolved beyond the need for traditional risk assessment because they could predict and prevent systemic failures before they occurred. Even the Andromedans, whose massive collective intelligence had guided galactic commerce for millennia, had politely but firmly rejected Marcus's warnings. Their response had come in the form of a complex mathematical proof that demonstrated why the current system was not only stable, but actually became more robust as it grew larger and more interconnected. They had included a suggestion that Marcus might benefit from advanced courses in xenoeconomics if he wished to better understand the principles that governed modern finance. The pattern was always the same. Marcus would present his data, The alien banking authorities would review it through their vastly superior analytical systems, and they would conclude that the human was simply too primitive to understand the elegant complexity of galactic finance. His warnings were filed away in databases that no one would ever check again, dismissed as the well-intentioned but ultimately irrelevant concerns of a species that had barely mastered interplanetary commerce. Dr. Sarah Williams, the chief financial officer for the Human Colonial Administration, had been sympathetic but ultimately powerless to act on Marcus's warnings. She had worked with him for 3 years and had learned to trust his instincts, even when she couldn't follow all of his calculations. But when she tried to present his concerns to the Galactic Banking Consortium's board of directors, she had been told that humans were welcome to participate in the financial system as clients, but should leave the management of galactic economics to species with the appropriate cognitive capabilities. The dismissal had stung, but it wasn't surprising. Humans had been the newcomers to galactic civilization for barely 2 centuries, and they were still proving themselves worthy of inclusion in the galaxy's more sophisticated institutions. The banking system had been functioning perfectly for 10 millennia before humans had even discovered fire, and it would continue functioning perfectly long after human civilization had run its course. Marcus had continued his work on New Geneva, processing the colony's modest financial transactions and filing his reports with the increasingly desperate certainty of someone who could see a disaster approaching but couldn't make anyone else look in the right direction. He had refined his calculations, double-checked his assumptions, and run simulations that all pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. The galactic financial system was a house of cards that had grown so large and complex that no one could see how precarious it had become. The first domino had fallen 3 weeks ago, when the Rigel Prime Agricultural Cooperative had defaulted on a seemingly insignificant loan. The amount was barely a rounding error in the galactic economy, but the loan had been packaged into a derivative instrument that was owned by a Centaurian investment fund, which had used it as collateral for a larger loan from the Sirius Banking Consortium, which had sold shares in the collateral to the Vega Financial Group, which had created a synthetic instrument based on the shares that was owned by pension funds across 17 different star systems. When the original loan went bad, the cascade of failures that followed had been swift and merciless. The quantum algorithms that were supposed to contain the damage had instead amplified it, automatically triggering sell orders that drove prices down, which triggered more sell orders in an accelerating spiral that no one could stop. The same interconnected complexity that had made the system so efficient had turned it into a weapon of mass financial destruction. The Galactic Banking Consortium had held emergency sessions, bringing together the finest financial minds from across the galaxy to address the crisis. The Zirion dynasty had deployed their most powerful analytical systems, running calculations that consumed the energy output of entire stars. The Zephyrian Banking Guild had formed collective intelligence networks that could process data faster than most species could think. The Andromedans had activated dormant portions of their vast consciousness that had been sleeping for centuries. None of it had worked. Every solution they tried had only made the problem worse, creating new complications that their models hadn't predicted. The quantum algorithms that had governed galactic finance for millennia were encountering scenarios that their programming had never anticipated, and they were responding by freezing up or making increasingly erratic decisions that sent shockwaves through the entire system. Director Vex Prime of the Zirion dynasty had called for calm, assuring the galaxy that the current difficulties were merely temporary fluctuations that would be corrected once their systems had time to adapt to the new market conditions. His crystalline form had flickered with the confident patterns that his species used to convey absolute certainty, and his mathematical projections had shown that stability would be restored within 72 hours. The 72 hours had passed, and the crisis had only deepened. The Sirius Banking Consortium had frozen all interstellar transfers, stranding millions of beings who suddenly couldn't access their funds. The Capella Credit Exchange had declared bankruptcy, wiping out the retirement savings of entire planetary populations. The Central Galactic Reserve had begun emergency printing of quantum currency, but the new money was being absorbed by the collapsing system so fast that it had no measurable effect on the crisis. Ambassador Keth Noor of the Zephyrian Banking Guild had appeared before the Galactic Council to explain that the current situation was unprecedented in the recorded history of galactic civilization. His energy patterns had fluctuated with uncertainty as he admitted that their quantum financial models were encountering paradoxes that shouldn't have been possible. The system that had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of crisis was somehow making it worse with every passing hour. The Andromedans had been even more direct in their assessment. Through their collective consciousness, they had announced that the mathematical foundations of galactic finance had become fundamentally unstable. The complexity that had once been the system's greatest strength had reached a critical threshold where minor fluctuations could trigger catastrophic failures. They had begun the process of withdrawing their vast resources from the galactic banking system, a move that sent panic through every remaining financial institution. Marcus had watched the crisis unfold from his small office on New Geneva with a mixture of vindication and horror. He had been right about the systemic vulnerabilities, but being right about a galactic financial collapse wasn't the kind of victory that anyone could celebrate. Billions of beings across the galaxy were losing their life savings, entire worlds were facing economic collapse, and the infrastructure that held galactic civilization together was crumbling. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Colonial Banking Authority had contacted him twice in the past week, asking if he had any insights into the current crisis that might help them protect human interests. Both times, Marcus had referred them to the reports he had filed months earlier, the same reports that had been dismissed as irrelevant by every major financial institution in the galaxy. The irony was bitter, but Marcus took no satisfaction in it. Captain Jessica Rodriguez, the administrator of New Geneva, had asked Marcus to brief her on what the colony could expect in the coming weeks. The question was simple, but the answer was terrifying. The galactic financial system was collapsing, and when it finally hit bottom, it would take the infrastructure of interstellar civilization with it. Trade routes would shut down, communication networks would fail, and the carefully balanced economy that supported billions of beings across thousands of worlds would simply cease to function. The human colonies were particularly vulnerable because they were still dependent on the older species for most of their advanced technology and infrastructure. When the galactic banking system collapsed, humanity would be cut off from the supply chains that kept their worlds running. Medical supplies, quantum processors, fusion reactors, and countless other essentials would become unavailable overnight. Marcus had tried to explain the situation to Captain Rodriguez in terms that didn't sound like the ravings of someone who had lost his mind. The mathematics were clear, but the implications were so vast that they seemed like science fiction rather than economic analysis. The galaxy was facing the first truly system-wide financial collapse in recorded history, and no one knew how to stop it. The emergency session of the Galactic Banking Consortium had been called for today, bringing together every major financial institution in the galaxy to address the crisis. Marcus had not been invited, of course. He was a human accountant from a minor agricultural world, hardly the kind of expert that the galaxy's financial elite would consult during their darkest hour. But he had been following the proceedings through the public broadcasts, watching as the most sophisticated financial minds in the galaxy struggled to understand what was happening to their perfect system. The quantum displays in the observation deck showed the latest casualty reports from across the galaxy. The Tau Ceti investment bank had collapsed, taking with it the pension funds of 4 billion beings. The Proxima Centauri Credit Union had declared emergency measures, freezing all accounts indefinitely. The Alpha Centauri Stock Exchange had suspended trading after losing 60% of its value in a single day. Marcus pulled up his personal tablet and reviewed the calculations he had been working on for the past 6 months. The numbers were worse than even his most pessimistic projections had suggested. The cascade of failures was accelerating, and the automated systems that were supposed to prevent systemic collapse were instead spreading the contagion faster than anyone could track it. The door to the observation deck slid open, and Director Vex Prime of the Xerion dynasty entered with his usual retinue of advisors and analysts. His crystalline form was flickering with stress patterns that Marcus had never seen before, and the mathematical projections that usually surrounded him like a glowing aura were chaotic and fragmented. Director Vex Prime noticed Marcus standing by the window and approached with the careful politeness that the galaxy's elder species used when addressing humans. His voice, when he spoke, carried the harmonic resonances that his species used to convey mathematical concepts directly to the listener's consciousness. "Mr. Chen, is it not?" the director said, his form brightening slightly as he accessed Marcus's personnel file. "You are the human accountant who has been filing reports about systemic vulnerabilities in our financial models." Marcus nodded, unsure whether he was about to be thanked for his warnings or blamed for the crisis that had vindicated them. "Yes, sir. I've been tracking the recursive debt loops and their potential for cascade failure." The director's form flickered with what Marcus had learned to recognize as the Xerion equivalent of surprise. "You predicted this collapse?" "The mathematics were clear," Marcus replied carefully. "The system had reached a critical threshold where minor fluctuations could trigger exponential failures. I tried to warn everyone, but we dismissed your concerns as the product of primitive thinking," the director finished, his form dimming with what appeared to be shame. "We believed that our advanced models had evolved beyond the need for such basic risk assessment." Marcus said nothing. There was no point in rehashing the dismissals and condescending rejections he had received over the past months. The crisis spoke for itself, and the galaxy's financial elite were finally beginning to understand that their sophisticated models had blind spots that simpler approaches could detect. "Mr. Chen," the director continued, his voice taking on a tone that Marcus had never heard from a Xerion before, uncertainty mixed with something that might have been desperation. "Our quantum processors are failing to find solutions to the current crisis. Our models predict continued collapse with no clear path to stability. We are facing the possibility of complete systemic failure within days." The admission hung in the air between them like a quantum equation that couldn't be solved. The most advanced financial civilization in galactic history was admitting that they were helpless in the face of a crisis that a human accountant had predicted months in advance. "I need to ask you something," the director said, his crystalline form leaning closer to Marcus. "In your analysis of the systemic vulnerabilities, did you identify any potential solutions? Any way to stop the cascade before it destroys everything we have built?" Marcus looked out at the banking district below, where emergency lights were flashing in the towers of institutions that had seemed invincible just weeks before. The question the director was asking was the one that Marcus had been dreading, because the answer he had to give would either save galactic civilization or confirm that it was doomed. The silence stretched between them as Marcus considered his response. He had solutions, theoretical frameworks that might stabilize the system and prevent total collapse, but implementing them would require the cooperation of every major financial institution in the galaxy, and it would mean abandoning the sophisticated models that had governed galactic finance for millennia in favor of approaches that the elder species had dismissed as primitive. "There might be a way," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it would require completely restructuring how galactic finance operates. Everything would have to change." Director Vex Prime's form blazed with sudden hope, the mathematical patterns around him reorganizing into configurations that Marcus recognized as expressions of desperate optimism. "Tell me," the director said. "Please. The galaxy is hours away from complete financial collapse. If you have solutions, we need to hear them." Marcus pulled up his tablet and showed the director the calculations he had been refining for months. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity, but they represented a fundamental rejection of everything the galactic financial system had become. Instead of recursive complexity, they emphasized transparent linearity. Instead of algorithmic automation, they relied on human judgment and intuition. Instead of exponential growth, they prioritized sustainable stability. "The current system is failing because it's become too complex for anyone to understand or control," Marcus explained, highlighting the key equations on his tablet. "Every transaction creates dozens of secondary effects, and those effects create tertiary effects until the system becomes chaotic. The solution is to simplify the structure, eliminate the recursive loops, and return to fundamental principles of value exchange." Director Vex Prime studied the calculations with the focused intensity that his species brought to mathematical analysis. The patterns around his crystalline form shifted and flowed as he processed the implications of what Marcus was proposing. When he finally looked up, his voice carried a note of disbelief. "You're suggesting that we abandon 10,000 years of financial evolution and return to primitive banking methods?" "I'm suggesting that we recognize that evolution isn't always improvement," Marcus replied. "Sometimes complexity becomes its own problem. The system you've built is remarkable, but it's become too sophisticated for its own good. It's like a machine with so many moving parts that no one can predict how it will behave when something goes wrong." The director's form flickered with the rapid calculations that his species used for deep analysis. Marcus could see the mathematical projections forming around the alien's consciousness as he worked through the implications of returning to simpler financial models. The process took several minutes, during which Marcus watched the banking district below continue its slide toward chaos. "Your solution would work," the director said finally, his voice carrying the certainty that came from mathematical proof. "The models are stable, the risk factors are manageable, and the potential for cascade failure is minimal. But implementing these changes would require dismantling the entire galactic financial infrastructure and rebuilding it from the ground up." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "That's exactly what it would require." "The other species will never agree to it," the director continued, his form dimming with renewed despair. "The Zephyrians have invested millennia in developing their quantum trading algorithms. The Andromedans have built their entire economic philosophy around collective resource management. The banking guilds across the galaxy have structured their entire existence around the current system. They will see your proposal as a step backward, a return to the primitive methods of younger civilizations." Marcus nodded. Unsurprised by the director's assessment, he had known from the beginning that his solutions would be difficult for the galaxy's elder species to accept. They had spent thousands of years developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to financial management, and admitting that simpler methods might be more effective would require a level of humility that didn't come naturally to beings who had considered themselves the pinnacle of economic evolution. "Then the galaxy will collapse," Marcus said simply, "because the current system can't be fixed. It can only be replaced." The director stared at him for a long moment, his crystalline form reflecting the emergency lights from the banking district below. The weight of impossible choices hung between them like a quantum equation with no solution. Save galactic civilization by admitting that human approaches might be superior to 10 millennia of alien sophistication, or watch everything collapse rather than abandon their pride. "I need to consult with the other directors," Vex Prime said finally. "This decision cannot be made by a single institution, no matter how desperate our situation becomes." Marcus watched as the director and his retinue left the observation deck, their crystalline forms already flickering with the rapid communications that would carry his proposal to the galaxy's financial elite. The quantum displays continued their relentless countdown toward collapse, showing red numbers that grew worse with each passing minute. The emergency session of the Galactic Banking Consortium was about to begin, and for the first time in galactic history, the survival of interstellar civilization would depend on whether the galaxy's most advanced species could swallow their pride and accept help from the humans they had always considered their inferiors. Marcus returned to the window and looked out at the banking district one last time. In a few hours, he would know whether his solutions would be given a chance to save the galaxy, or whether the greatest financial system in known history would collapse under the weight of its own sophisticated complexity. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. The species that had been dismissed as too primitive for serious financial work might be the only ones capable of preventing the collapse of galactic civilization. But first, the galaxy's elder species would have to admit that sometimes the most advanced solution was also the simplest one. The quantum displays flickered red, the emergency lights continued their desperate warnings, and Marcus Chen stood alone in the observation deck, holding in his hands the mathematical equations that could either save or doom the galaxy, depending on whether anyone would listen to a human accountant who had seen the crisis coming from the very beginning. The emergency session of the Galactic Banking Consortium had ended in chaos 3 hours ago, and Marcus Chen found himself standing in the ruins of 10,000 years of financial certainty. The consortium's final decision had been swift and predictable. They would handle the crisis using their own methods, thank you very much, and human input was neither required nor welcome. Director Vex Prime had delivered the consortium's response, with the cold formality that elder species reserve for moments when they needed to reassert their superiority. The gathered representatives from across the galaxy had listened to Marcus's proposals with polite attention, analyzed his mathematics with their quantum processors, and concluded that while his calculations were technically sound, implementing such primitive solutions would be an admission of failure that their civilizations could not accept. The Zephyrian Banking Guild had been particularly vocal in their rejection. Flux 79 had declared that reverting to human-style linear financial models would be equivalent to abandoning space travel in favor of walking. The Andromedans had agreed, stating through their collective consciousness that the proposed solutions represented an unacceptable regression in economic evolution. Even the younger species that had joined the consortium in recent millennia had sided with tradition, unwilling to risk their standing by supporting radical changes proposed by the galaxy's newest members. Marcus had listened to the rejection with the same calm dignity he had shown 6 months earlier when his warnings were first dismissed. He had thanked the consortium for their consideration, gathered his data tablets, and walked out of the Great Chamber while the galaxy's financial elite resumed their desperate attempts to solve the crisis using the same methods that had created it. Now he sat in the small apartment that the human colonial administration had provided for visiting personnel on Nexus Prime, watching the galactic economy tear itself apart in real time. The quantum displays showed cascading failures spreading through star system after star system, as the automated trading algorithms that had once been the pride of galactic civilization turned into engines of destruction. His personal communicator chimed with an incoming transmission from Dr. Sarah Williams back on New Geneva. Her face appeared on the holographic display, but the usual confidence in her expression had been replaced by barely controlled panic. "Marcus, thank God you're available," she said without preamble. "The situation here is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. The Colonial Banking Authority just informed us that all human accounts in the galactic financial system have been frozen indefinitely. We can't access our funds, we can't process transactions, and we can't even communicate with our banking representatives." Marcus leaned back in his chair, unsurprised by the news but still feeling the weight of its implications. "How long before the colony runs out of essential supplies?" 3 weeks, maybe 4 if we ration everything strictly," Sarah replied. "But that's assuming we can find anyone willing to trade with us, using alternative payment methods. Most of our suppliers are just as frozen out of the system as we are." The irony was bitter, but not unexpected. The human colonies had been integrated into the galactic financial system specifically to prevent the kind of isolation they were now experiencing. By tying their economic survival to the consortium's infrastructure, they had made themselves vulnerable to exactly the kind of systemic collapse that Marcus had predicted. "What about the other human colonies?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Same situation across the board," Sarah confirmed. "New Terra, Keplia Station, the mining colonies in the Centauri sector. Everyone's cut off from the galactic banking system. The colonial administration is trying to coordinate some kind of alternative network, but we don't have the infrastructure to handle interstellar commerce without the consortium systems." Marcus studied the financial data streaming across his secondary display, watching the consortium's continued attempts to contain the crisis through increasingly desperate measures. They had deployed emergency quantum processors that consumed the energy output of entire planets, activated artificial intelligence systems that had been dormant for centuries, and even attempted to manually override the algorithmic trading networks that had become the backbone of galactic commerce. Nothing was working. Every intervention seemed to accelerate the collapse rather than slow it down. The mathematical models that had governed galactic finance for millennia were encountering scenarios that their programming had never anticipated, and they were responding by making increasingly erratic decisions that sent shockwaves through every remaining stable institution. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me," Marcus said, his mind already working through the possibilities that the consortium's rejection had opened up. "Contact every human colony administrator and arrange a secure conference call. We need to discuss setting up our own financial network." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise and concern. "Marcus, we can't just abandon the galactic financial system. Even if we could create our own network, we'd be completely isolated from the rest of galactic civilization." "The galactic financial system is abandoning us," Marcus replied calmly. "And frankly, being isolated from a collapsing system might be the best thing that could happen to us right now." The next 18 hours passed in a blur of calculations, communications, and increasingly frantic messages from human colonies across the galaxy. Marcus had barely slept as he worked to design a financial framework that could operate independently of the consortium's infrastructure, while still maintaining the stability and efficiency that interstellar commerce required. The solution he developed was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of relying on the recursive complexity that had made the galactic system so vulnerable, the human network would use direct value exchanges backed by physical commodities and verified through distributed verification networks. Each colony would maintain its own local banking system while participating in a larger network that could facilitate interstellar trade without depending on the consortium's quantum processors or algorithmic trading platforms. The conference call with the human colony administrators had been scheduled for 1400 hours Galactic Standard Time, and Marcus had spent the morning refining his presentation to address the concerns and objections he knew would arise. The plan he was proposing was radical by galactic standards, but it was also humanity's best chance of surviving the ongoing financial collapse. Captain Rodriguez from New Geneva was the first to connect to the secure channel, followed quickly by Administrator Thompson from New Terra, Director Park from Kepler Station, and representatives from 17 other human settlements across the galaxy. The faces that appeared on Marcus's display showed the strain of the past week, but also a determination that had become characteristic of human expansion into space. "Thank you all for joining this emergency session," Marcus began, sharing his prepared presentation with the group. "As you're all aware, the galactic financial crisis has effectively cut human colonies off from the banking systems we've relied on for the past 2 centuries. The Galactic Banking Consortium has made it clear that they consider human input irrelevant to solving their current problems, which means we need to find our own solutions." Administrator Thompson from New Terra was the first to respond, his weathered face showing the skepticism that Marcus had expected. "Marcus, what you're proposing is essentially economic secession from galactic civilization. Even if we could make it work technically, the political implications would be enormous." "The political implications of economic collapse would be worse," Marcus replied. "The consortium system is failing, and they're not interested in the solutions that might save it. We can either go down with their ship, or we can build our own." Director Park from Kepler Station leaned forward in her display, studying the financial models that Marcus had shared. "These calculations assume that we can maintain trade relationships with non-consortium species. What makes you think anyone will be willing to work with an independent human financial network?" Marcus pulled up a secondary display showing the economic data he had been analyzing throughout the morning. "Because the consortium's collapse is creating opportunities for everyone who's been excluded from their system. There are dozens of species that have never been allowed to join the banking consortium, either because they're too young, too small, or too different from the established norms. They're facing the same isolation we are, and they need alternatives just as badly as we do." The conversation continued for over 3 hours as Marcus walked the colony administrators through every aspect of his proposed financial network. The technical challenges were significant but manageable, the political risks were real but acceptable, and the potential benefits were substantial enough to justify the effort required. The turning point came when Captain Rodriguez asked the question that everyone had been avoiding. "Marcus, if we do this and it works, what happens when the consortium realizes that we've created a viable alternative to their system?" Marcus had been expecting this question, and his answer was ready. "Then they'll have to decide whether their pride is more important than their survival. The same choice they're facing right now, except by then we'll have proven that human approaches to financial management actually work." The vote to proceed with the independent human financial network was unanimous, though several administrators expressed reservations about the speed with which they were being forced to make such a momentous decision. Marcus understood their concerns, but the galactic crisis was accelerating faster than anyone had anticipated, and delay would only make their situation worse. Within hours of the conference call's conclusion, Marcus found himself coordinating the largest financial engineering project in human history. Colony administrators began implementing local banking systems based on his specifications, human merchants started exploring alternative trade routes that bypassed consortium-controlled infrastructure, and technical teams began building the communication networks that would allow independent human settlements to coordinate their economic activities. The work was complicated by the fact that humans had never operated their own interstellar financial system before. They had always been junior partners in the consortium's framework, handling local transactions while leaving the complex interstellar commerce to alien institutions with millennia of experience. Now they were being forced to develop that expertise from scratch, while the galactic economy collapsed around them. Dr. Emily Watson, the chief economist for the colonial administration, contacted Marcus on the second day of the project with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Marcus, the preliminary models look incredibly promising, but we're encountering problems we didn't anticipate. Some of the human colonies have been so integrated into the consortium's systems that they don't have the basic infrastructure to operate independently." Marcus had expected this challenge, though the scope of the problem was larger than he had hoped. "Which colonies are most affected?" "The newer settlements, mostly," Emily replied. "Places like Tau Ceti Prime and the Vega research stations. They've been relying on consortium infrastructure for everything from currency management to transaction processing. They literally don't have the hardware to implement your banking protocols." The solution that Marcus developed was characteristically human in its creativity and resourcefulness. Instead of trying to replicate the consortium's sophisticated quantum processing systems, The human network would use distributed computing resources spread across multiple colonies. Each settlement would contribute processing power to the network based on their capabilities, creating a resilient system that could continue functioning even if individual nodes went offline. The approach required unprecedented cooperation between human colonies that had often competed with each other for resources and opportunities. But the crisis had created a shared sense of purpose that transcended the usual political boundaries. Within a week, human settlements across the galaxy were sharing computing resources, technical expertise, and financial reserves in ways that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The first successful interstellar transaction using the human financial network took place 8 days after Marcus had walked out of the consortium's emergency session. New Geneva successfully purchased manufacturing equipment from New Terra using the new currency protocols, with the transaction processed entirely through human-controlled systems and verified by the distributed network that connected human colonies across 17 star systems. The success of that first transaction opened the floodgates for human commerce that had been frozen by the consortium's crisis. Within 48 hours, trade was flowing between human settlements at levels that exceeded pre-crisis volumes. The new system was not only working, it was proving to be more efficient and reliable than the consortium infrastructure it had replaced. Marcus monitored the network's performance from his apartment on Nexus Prime, watching with satisfaction as the financial framework he had designed demonstrated its stability under real-world conditions. The mathematics were holding up perfectly, the distributed processing was handling transaction volumes without strain, and the security protocols were preventing the kind of cascade failures that had brought down the consortium's quantum systems. More importantly, news of the human financial network's success was spreading beyond human space. Representatives from the Regal Trading Cooperative had contacted the colonial administration about joining the network, followed by inquiries from the Tau Ceti Independent Worlds and the Outer Rim Merchants Alliance. Species that had been excluded from the consortium's exclusive system were suddenly interested in what the humans had built. The Draconian Mining Guild was the first non-human organization to formally join the human financial network, bringing with them extensive mineral extraction operations and manufacturing capabilities that had been cut off from galactic markets by the consortium's collapse. Their integration into the system was seamless, proving that Marcus's protocols could handle the complexity of multi-species commerce without the bureaucratic overhead that had made the consortium so unwieldy. Within 2 weeks, the human financial network had grown from a desperate survival measure to a legitimate alternative to the galactic banking system. 12 non-human species had requested membership, trade volumes were exceeding all projections, and the network's distributed architecture was proving remarkably resistant to the kind of systemic failures that continued to plague the consortium. The irony was not lost on Marcus that the financial system he had designed in response to galactic rejection was becoming more successful than the institution that had dismissed his warnings. The human approach to banking, with its emphasis on transparency, simplicity, and distributed resilience, was attracting exactly the kind of innovative and adaptable species that thrived in dynamic environments. Dr. Sarah Williams contacted him with updates that seemed almost too good to believe. "Marcus, you need to see the latest economic projections. The human network is processing more interstellar transactions per day than the consortium managed at its peak. Our member species are reporting economic growth rates that were considered impossible under the old system." Marcus reviewed the data with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust results that seemed too positive. But the numbers were solid, verified through multiple independent sources, and confirmed by economic analysis from species that had no reason to inflate human achievements. The success was real, and it was accelerating. The human financial network had become a proof of concept for post-consortium economics, demonstrating that simpler approaches could be more effective than the sophisticated systems that had dominated galactic commerce for millennia. The consortium, meanwhile, continued its downward spiral. 3 more major banking houses had collapsed in the past week, and the emergency measures implemented by the remaining institutions were creating new instabilities faster than they could be contained. The mathematical models that had once been the pride of galactic civilization were now actively working against recovery, creating feedback loops that amplified every problem and prevented any meaningful progress toward stability. Marcus received a personal message from Director Vex Prime on the 15th day after the consortium's rejection of his proposals. The crystalline being's form was dimmer than Marcus remembered, and the mathematical patterns that usually surrounded him were fragmented and chaotic. "Mr. Chen," the director began, his voice carrying harmonics that Marcus had learned to associate with profound distress. "I must inform you that the consortium's situation has become untenable. We have exhausted every conventional approach to crisis management, and our quantum processors are predicting total systemic collapse within days." Marcus listened to the message without interruption, watching as one of the galaxy's most sophisticated beings struggled to find words for an unprecedented situation. "I am contacting you not in my official capacity as a consortium director, but as a being who recognizes that our pride may have cost us everything," Vex Prime continued. "Your human financial network has achieved stability and growth that our models cannot explain. We need to understand how you accomplished what our most advanced systems could not." The request for information was carefully phrased to avoid any admission of institutional failure, but Marcus understood the desperation behind the formal language. The consortium was finally ready to consider that human approaches might have value, but they still couldn't bring themselves to ask for help directly. Marcus crafted his response with the same dignity he had shown throughout the crisis. He provided detailed technical documentation about the human network's architecture, explained the mathematical principles that made it stable, and offered to share any additional information that might help the consortium understand why simpler approaches could be more effective than complex ones. He did not, however, offer to help them implement those approaches. The consortium had made their choice when they rejected his proposals 2 weeks earlier, and the consequences of that choice would have to be faced by the beings who had made it. The galaxy was changing, and for the first time in millennia, humans were leading that change rather than following it. The emergency beacon from the Galactic Banking Consortium reached Marcus Chen at 0347 hours Galactic Standard Time, 3 months after the human financial network had become the dominant economic system in the Outer Territories. The message was brief and carried the authentication codes reserved for galaxy-wide catastrophes. Total consortium collapse was imminent, and they were formally requesting immediate assistance from any available financial institutions. Marcus read the transmission twice before its full implications sank in. The most powerful economic organization in galactic history was sending out a distress call, and they were addressing it to anyone who might be able to help. The proud institution that had dismissed human expertise as primitive was now desperate enough to accept aid from any source. The Human Financial Collective, as the network had come to be known, was no longer the desperate survival measure it had been when Marcus first proposed it. Over the past 90 days, it had grown into an economic powerhouse that encompassed 47 different species across 312 star systems. The distributed architecture that Marcus had designed had proven capable of handling transaction volumes that dwarfed anything the consortium had ever achieved, while maintaining the transparency and stability that had made it attractive to species seeking alternatives to traditional galactic banking. Director Elena Vasquez, who had been elected as the collective's first coordinator, contacted Marcus within minutes of receiving the consortium's distress call. Her face on the holographic display showed the calm confidence that had made her the natural choice to lead humanity's bold experiment in interstellar finance. "Marcus, I assume you've seen the emergency transmission," she said without preamble. "The consortium is requesting immediate intervention to prevent total economic collapse. How do you want to handle this?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, aboard the flagship of the collective's new mobile banking fleet, considering the irony of the situation. 3 months ago, he had been a minor accountant whose warnings were dismissed by the galaxy's financial elite. Now those same institutions were begging for rescue from the network he had created in response to their rejection. "What's the current assessment of the consortium's condition?" Marcus asked, though he had been monitoring their decline through the collective's intelligence networks. "Complete systemic failure within 18 hours, Elena replied, consulting her data tablet. "Their quantum processors have entered recursive error loops that are actually accelerating the collapse rather than preventing it. Every automated intervention is making the situation worse, and they've lost the ability to perform manual overrides." The reports from consortium space painted a picture of unprecedented chaos. The Zirion dynasty's crystalline banking houses were literally cracking under the computational stress of trying to solve unsolvable equations. The Zephyrian energy beings were fragmenting as their collective consciousness struggled to process the mathematical impossibilities their own systems had created. Even the ancient Andromedans had begun shutting down portions of their vast intelligence to protect themselves from the cognitive damage being caused by their failing financial models. "There's more," Elena continued, her expression growing grim. The collapse is triggering secondary effects across their territory. Power grids are failing because they can't process payment for energy distribution. Food supply chains are breaking down because automated purchasing systems have stopped working. Some worlds are reporting complete infrastructure collapse. Marcus pulled up the real-time data feeds from consortium space, watching as the carefully maintained civilization that had ruled the galaxy for millennia disintegrated in slow motion. The mathematical precision that had been their greatest strength had become a weakness when their models encountered scenarios they couldn't process. Every system was connected to every other system, which meant that when the financial core failed, everything else failed with it. The Strategic Council of the Human Financial Collective convened an emergency session within 2 hours of the consortium's distress call. Representatives from all major member species participated in the debate over how to respond to the crisis. The discussion was heated but respectful, reflecting the collaborative culture that had made the collective so successful. Ambassador Torres, from the Regal Trading Cooperative, argued for immediate humanitarian intervention. Regardless of how they treated us in the past, we can't stand by and watch billions of beings suffer because their leaders made poor decisions. We have the resources and expertise to help them stabilize their systems. Captain Morrison from the Draconian Mining Guild took a harder line. They rejected our assistance, when it could have prevented this crisis entirely. Now they expect us to risk our own stability to rescue them from consequences they created themselves. Why should we expose our network to potential contamination from their failing systems? Marcus listened to the debate for over an hour before Elena called on him to present his recommendation. The decision would ultimately belong to the full council, but his expertise had been the foundation of the collective's success, and his opinion would carry significant weight. The consortium's request for assistance presents us with both an opportunity and a test, Marcus began, addressing the assembled representatives through the holographic conference system. We can demonstrate that our approach to galactic economics is not only more effective, but also more ethical than the exclusionary policies they practiced for millennia. He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. However, any intervention we undertake must be on our terms, using our methods, and with full recognition that the age of consortium dominance is over. We're not rescuing their system, we're replacing it. The proposal that Marcus outlined was comprehensive and decisive. The Human Financial Collective would offer emergency economic assistance to consortium space, but only through integration with the collective's network. The consortium's failing quantum systems would be gradually shut down and replaced with distributed processing nodes based on human protocols. Species that accepted the transition would become full members of the collective with equal voting rights and access to all network benefits. Most importantly, the rescue operation would be led by human expertise and governed by human principles of transparency, cooperation, and sustainable growth. The mathematical models that had governed galactic finance for millennia would be archived as historical curiosities, replaced by approaches that prioritize stability over complexity and cooperation over hierarchy. The vote was closer than Marcus had expected, but the final decision was to proceed with the intervention. The collective would attempt to save galactic civilization, but the civilization that emerged would be fundamentally different from the one that had rejected human participation just months earlier. The rescue operation began within 6 hours of the Council's decision. Human financial engineers, accompanied by technical specialists from allied species, deployed to consortium space aboard the fastest ships in the collective's fleet. Their mission was to establish emergency economic stability in critical systems while beginning the process of transitrating existing infrastructure to the new network protocols. Marcus led the primary intervention team to Nexus Prime, where the consortium's Central Banking Authority was experiencing complete systemic breakdown. The quantum displays that had once shown the elegant complexity of galactic finance now flickered with error messages and recursive failures that no one could solve. Director Vex Prime met the human team at the docking bay, his crystalline form so dim with stress patterns that he was barely recognizable. The mathematical projections that had once surrounded him like a glowing aura were chaotic fragments that hurt to look at directly. "Mr. Chen," the director said, his voice carrying harmonics of defeat and desperate hope. "Thank you for coming. Our situation is worse than we reported. The cascade failures have spread to our basic infrastructure systems. We estimate complete societal collapse within 12 hours. Marcus surveyed the banking district through the shuttle's viewports, noting the emergency evacuations and the dark towers where power systems had failed. The sight was both tragic and predictable. the inevitable result of building a civilization on mathematical models that couldn't adapt to unexpected circumstances. Director, we're here to help, but you need to understand that the help we're offering will fundamentally change how this system operates, Marcus explained as his team began unpacking their equipment. The consortium's approach to banking created this crisis, and we can't fix it by using the same methods that caused it. The process of replacing the consortium's quantum systems with collective protocols was complex, but surprisingly straightforward. The human engineers had spent months refining their integration procedures while incorporating new member species, and they had developed methods for transitioning even the most sophisticated alien technologies to the new network architecture. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the consortium's failing quantum processors could be repurposed as verification nodes for the distributed network. Instead of trying to fix their recursive algorithms, the human team simply bypassed them, using the quantum hardware to verify transactions processed through simpler but more reliable methods. Within 18 hours, basic banking services had been restored to Nexus Prime. Within 48 hours, the emergency integration protocols had stabilized the entire central system. Within a week, the former heart of the Galactic Banking Consortium was operating more efficiently than it had in decades, processing transactions through the Human Financial Collective's network with unprecedented speed and reliability. The transformation spread rapidly through former consortium space as world after world requested integration with the collective's network. The alternative was economic isolation and eventual collapse, so the choice was easy for most systems to make. The species that had once considered themselves the galaxy's financial elite found themselves applying for membership in an organization led by the humans they had previously dismissed. The psychological impact of the role reversal was profound. The Zirion dynasty, whose mathematical supremacy had been the foundation of their cultural identity, had to accept that human intuition could solve problems that their quantum processors couldn't handle. The Zephyrian Banking Guild discovered that distributed networks could be more efficient than their collective consciousness approaches. Even the ancient Andromedans acknowledged that simpler methods could be more effective than their millennia of accumulated complexity. Marcus found himself in the unprecedented position of having former consortium directors asking him for guidance on basic financial principles. The beings who had once lectured him about the limitations of human thinking were now students seeking to understand how the species they had rejected had created something superior to their most advanced systems. Director Vex Prime approached Marcus during the final phase of Nexus Prime's integration, his crystalline form now flickering with patterns that Marcus had learned to recognize as profound humility. "Mr. Chen, I owe you an apology that cannot adequately be expressed in any language," the director said, his mathematical harmonics carrying notes of genuine remorse. "We dismissed your warnings because we believed our sophistication made us immune to the basic principles you understood. We were wrong about everything that mattered." Marcus accepted the apology with the same grace he had shown throughout the crisis. "Director, the important thing now is that we're working together to build something better. The consortium era is over, but galactic civilization doesn't have to end with it." The ceremony marking the formal dissolution of the Galactic Banking Consortium and the establishment of the Universal Financial Collective took place 6 months after Marcus had first walked out of their emergency session. Representatives from over 200 species gathered on Haven Station, a neutral world that had become the new center of galactic economics. Elena Vasquez, now serving as the first Director General of the Universal Financial Collective, addressed the assembly with words that would be remembered as the beginning of a new era in galactic civilization. "Today we mark not just the end of one economic system and the beginning of another, but a fundamental change in how intelligent species cooperate across the galaxy," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast assembly hall. The old system was built on hierarchy, exclusion, and the belief that complexity was equivalent to superiority. The new system is built on equality, inclusion, and the understanding that the best solutions are often the simplest ones. Marcus watched from the audience as species that had warred for millennia signed cooperation agreements, as former enemies became economic partners, and as the galaxy's younger civilizations took their places as equals alongside ancient powers that had finally learned humility. The Universal Financial Collective had become more than just a banking system. It was a new model for galactic governance based on cooperation rather than domination. The mathematical principles that Marcus had developed in response to the consortium's rejection had evolved into social and political frameworks that were reshaping interstellar civilization. The final irony was that the species once judged too primitive for galactic banking had not only saved the galaxy's economy, but had used that success to create the most inclusive and stable interstellar civilization in recorded history. The humans who had been dismissed as too emotional and chaotic had proven that sometimes the heart was smarter than the most sophisticated quantum processor. As Marcus looked out at the assembly of beings celebrating the birth of a new galactic order, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The rejection that had seemed like humanity's greatest failure had become the catalyst for their greatest success. The galaxy had learned that wisdom didn't always come from the oldest species or the most advanced technology. Sometimes it came from the courage to question established assumptions and the willingness to try something different. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibilities that the old consortium had never imagined. And at the center of it all was a simple truth that Marcus had known from the beginning. The most complex problems sometimes required the simplest solutions, and the greatest civilizations were built not on exclusion and hierarchy, but on cooperation and mutual respect. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.